Xerxes does not represent the truly ancient, for he is around 500 BC. Unlike the people who came before him, he has seen the world in its entirety. He has stretched as far as he possibly could. He has seen the Indians, he has seen the Europeans, and he has seen the Africans as far as the world stretched back then. The other ancients who came way before him had no idea how big the world was, but Xerxes ventured far and wide, even setting up a mission to try and go around Africa, failing only when he got to the Horn of Africa and returning out of fear. That's why this image that he made speaks volumes. It has almost every type of human that existed at that time and what lands they came from. He knew what he had stumbled on was something very important, but did he know how important it would be to people in the 21st century? Now, I know some of you will say we've already seen this, but here's something you didn't see. You didn't see it with the context of time and space. So, this is why I showed you the maps of Africa and Sumeria and Persia and Elam to show you just how distant they are from one another. There's something that I actually missed about this particular engraving, and that's the fact that it has the people at the top representing the East and the people at the bottom representing the West. I completely missed that the first time I saw this. Start off with Persia, his homeland. Then we go to Media, then Elam, Parthia, Aria, Bactria, Sogdia, Koremzia, Zarangia, Arachosnia, Satangnia, Gandhira, Indus, Sakahamva. Now, before we go to his western states, we have to first consider what we have just seen. You notice that all of them are in, let's call it, the Far East compared to Africa and even Mesopotamia. It's the places that have just been pointed out are right next to India, just above or right next to it. Whereas now, what he's going to do is he's going to list the countries that are to the west of Persia. And you can see that he does this intentionally to show the difference. But something that you see is that the people at the north, they almost look identical to each other, with the exception of those that have been completely obliterated, where you can't see what they look like at all. But you'll notice that as you go western, you'll start to see people look a little more European or a little more African. He starts off very far in the west. Ethiopia, starting very far off in the west. Libya, Ionia, Scudria or Sardis, Saka, Ionia again, Lydia, Cappadocia, Armenia, Egypt, Arabia, Assyria, Babylon, and Saka overseas. The only two people in this image that are pictured with having no hair on their face is the Egyptian and the Nubian. And you can see that the Libyan has some small hair, but it's different. All these Indo-Europeans down here, because the two groups that are being represented in the western side are Indo-Europeans, well, Western Indo-Europeans and Western Afro-Asiatics. And if you look at the top, the people who are being represented there are Eastern Semitics and Eastern Indo-Europeans, like the Aryans and so forth, including the Indus people. By the time of Xerxes, the Indo-European language had already reached there. So why does this matter? Well, it matters for a couple reasons. Firstly, two people who live right close to each other both don't shave their hair, while everybody else is being pictured as shaving their hair. Now, there's this theory that the Arabians started the Egyptian population, but this can't be true because clearly the Arabians are not being pictured here. Everyone is given a general face that looks the same, so don't get thrown off by that. The Nubian is given that face, and so is the Egyptian. But you can tell that culturally, these two people are completely different than everybody else who is pictured here. The people, like the Ionians and some of these other people, you can see their hair is finer than that of the Middle Easterners that are being portrayed in these images or in this image. And that is clearly because these people are completely different. Some are pictured with helmets, some are pictured with not. The only thing that we can't conclude from this is every single person's language, but we do know what languages people spoke from place to place. If we go back a further 500 years from the time of Xerxes, we will meet a man named Ramses II. In his time, he would meet two groups, Asiatic and Nubians, same as Xerxes, but starting from Egypt. And to the left, you can see at the top, it depicts Nubians that are captured, their hair consistent with Africans today. At the bottom, you see Asiatics, their hair consistent with the hair that Asiatics have today. So, what happened? Why is it that these ancient carvings, these ancient reliefs, still depict the lines that were drawn in the modern time? Why is it that if we look at as far back as we can go in Egypt depicting Asiatics, they depict them looking like what Asiatics look like today, especially Asiatics from very far away, like Babylon. But then when they portray the Nubians, again, it's the same Nubians that we get today in the same location, in the same typical locations. The only group that seems to completely smash this idea is the Egyptians. The Egyptians themselves don't seem to look like any of the Asiatics. And to be certain, they don't fully look like the Nubians either. But they do have African faces. Now, what do we do with this? Knowing that people back then were so good at keeping records. Well, even if we go back and look at what the Sumerians looked like, or the Indians, how they thought they looked like, or the Indo-Europeans in general, like the Aryans, what did they think they looked like? We can see that this type of face comes from the Central East, places like India, Afghanistan, and Sumeria, you know. So in the ancient terms, it would be the Indus Valley, Elam, Sumeria, Arcadia. And now take this in, absorb it with everything else I've said before. The fact that the Afroasiatic language starts somewhere in Chad and spreads out through towards Egypt and spreads to the west as well towards the Berber regions. Mix that in with the fact that Indo-Europeans come in way later and change the way even Persians look like. Persians became lighter skinned than what they would have been before the mix of Indo-Europeans. Persians would have been something closer to what Indians look like today if it weren't for this extra Indo-European mix. And as you can see, places like Aria, which have a deep amount of Indo-European, they're right next to it. The modern version of human beings, though different than the people in the past, and they moved a lot. Do not get me wrong, people were moving. They still represent something that is so obvious to see that it's startling. Why is it? Why is it that the entire globe seems to have this consistency that cannot really be broken? And of course, I could show you all kinds of African statues or whatever, but we don't even need to go there. The only thing you need to worry about when it comes to the African statues is that Africans almost never portray themselves with a beard. We grow beards, but we almost never portray ourselves with a beard. And this is true even in Egypt. But then if you go look at Greece, go look at Rome, go look at Persia, go look at Sumeria, go look at anywhere where it's way further out than Egypt, you start seeing it being done. And then of course, when it's Eastern people who've moved in to Afro-Asiatic regions, they start portraying themselves with beards later on. Everyone is seeing the same thing when they look at Asiatic people. They portray them looking the same way. But I guess everybody is just lying. So that's problem solved, right? Nope, not really. Because if we look into the Iranians, the Persians, what we see is that they are one of the most diverse groups of people by haplogroup. So, for example, we see that they have the haplogroups of Europe, they have the haplogroups of the Middle East, they have the haplogroups of South Asians, that means Indians, and to a small degree, they have a African component, the E component. This does not mean anything that big in modern times because how many people have traveled that far, but it means something bigger if you start tracing back the steps. When did these things enter? And if we look at the migrations that I just listed, there's a lot of migrations that I could start talking about. So it's not as simple as they just look like that. Now, this is a Akkadian image or a Sumerian, and it's very, very old, meaning that this is what these people would have looked like before most of these migrations had even started. But with the South Asian DNA, the only thing that we can say about it in Irania is Pakistan is right next to Iran. Therefore, the Indians must have just moved in there at some point to have such a high amount of their DNA. Number two, in the Indo-Europeans that migrated down, that's probably where they picked up the European DNA. Number three, the Middle Eastern DNA, they probably got that from the Sumerians. And then number four, the African DNA. Now, where could they have gotten that? Was it the Egyptians that once spread far and wide all the way to these regions? Was it the Phoenicians carrying these DNA? What was it? Who was it? Or was it the recent slave trade? And of course, that would bring up the question, how many slaves did they really bring to Iran? But like I showed you here, they clearly show. So it says here Y chromosome diversity, and the results suggest that there was already rather high Y chromosome diversity during the Neolithic period, placing Iranian populations in between Europeans, Middle Easterners, and South Asians. So obviously the Africans are left out here, but you can tell that there are still a whole bunch of groups that have been put inside. There's this thing where we all assume that Indians are Caucasians in because that's how they explain. But the type of Indian that are Caucasian is because of the Indo-European mix. So before they visualized or you could see them as Caucasian, they would have been very dark skinned, and that would have mattered back in the day if the other people were not. These huts that resemble true African huts are from Iran, and the person who is in between them is an Afro-Iranian. Afro-Iranians number to about 1 million, while the Iranian population is about 88 million, of course, comprising of people who are mixed with different peoples. But think about this for a second. Think about those huts. Think about the fact that that design was invented first in Africa, because I want to talk about that in my next video. That hut shape, the fact that you don't find it anywhere else in the world. The technique is unique.